when I say the word Disney, what do you think about? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? For most people, it'd probably be this, or this, or this, or maybe some of these. Doesn't really matter. Whether you're thinking about Oliver and Company or Winter Soldier, everything that falls underneath the Disney umbrella shares one thing in common: money. Disney came out of the gate with their first feature for the silver screen, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937. Adjusted to inflation, the New Boy classic raked in over $1.1 billion at the box office, and lifetime gross puts it over $3 billion. After 2015, The Force Awakens grossed over $2 billion, and that was over 810% of the film's budget. Disney might have been shaky about his feelings towards, the Jews, but there's one thing he knew, and that is how to be the Jay-Z of feature-length animated films. And that business acumen stuck with the company long after he passed. Whether it be theme parks or cape shit or killing YouTube networks, the roots of Disney in entertainment are as numerous as they are deep, and they're all flowing with liquid gold. Animation monolith or not though, even gods can bleed, and that's what we're talking about tonight, so put on your thinking caps and strap in. I'm really smart and this is Treasure Planet, Disney's biggest mistake. Alright, so what is Treasure Planet? The love child and passion project of directing super duo in the animation world Ron Clements and John Musker, known most notably for their work on The Great Mouse Detective, The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Hercules, and more recently, Surf's Up 3. Basically, their films are half the reason that the late 80s through the 90s are referred to as the Disney Renaissance. The only thing is, they didn't particularly want to direct any of those films. See, after working as character animators on The Fox and the Hound and writers on The Black Cauldron, they came to the chairman of Walt Disney Pictures at the time, Jeffrey Katzenberg, with a simple wish. We want to adapt Treasure Island and we want to put it in space. Now, you could chalk up Katzenberg telling them no to him just hating fun and cool things that are good and nice, but it's important to understand the context of this request. See, this is coming off the release of The Black Cauldron, which is historically one of Disney's worst flops ever, and these guys worked on it. Even worse, following the trash fire that was The Black Cauldron's box office performance, Disney had to downgrade their entire animation process. Their animation department didn't even get to stay in their Burbank lot and had to be moved to a warehouse, or else they'd have to have shut down that entire wing of Disney Pictures. There's a reason it's called the film that almost killed Disney. Anyways, with all this in mind, Katzenberg laid down the law and sent them off to direct The Great Mouse Detective instead, to warm critical reception and great performance at the box office. A year after it was released in 1987, they approached him again with the same request. Disney's already adapted Treasure Island once, we just want to create our own reimagining of the source material for a new audience. To which Katzenberg's reply was something to the tune of "Pirates are gay, go make mermaids." And they did. 1990, still no Treasure Planet, go make Aladdin. 1992, still no Treasure Planet, but at this point Katzenberg decided to strike a deal with them. They had done what the suits up top had told them to for 5 films, and if they did it one more time, they got their dream project. Clements and Musker started work on Hercules later that year, and in the meantime had their good friends Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, who had been their co-writers on Aladdin, write a treatment and rough script for their project. The same Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio that about 10 years later would go on to release their own swashbuckling adventure, Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl. So they finished Hercules, they have a script for their pitch, and even though it turned out to be kind of a disappointment in terms of opening week sales, Katz was a man of his word, and he gave the green light to the duo's working title, Treasure Island in Space. One of Disney's most visually compelling features ever produced, and my personal favorite from the happiest animation studio on earth, but what would ultimately become one of the biggest failures in the company's history. Ironically fitting for the pair of ambitious directors who had helped write The Black Cauldron. Before I get into why it failed, though, I want to talk a little bit about why it shouldn't have, or rather, why it didn't, at least not in terms of the vision. So, starting from the top. Alright, so Treasure Planet is a visual marvel in Disney's stable of animated flicks, and they don't waste any time improving it, in one of my favorite character introduction sequences ever. The film opens with a slow pan of the Ethereum, Clements and Musker's reimagining of space in an effort to create something more warm and full of life, complete with breathable air and currents of solar winds. As the title card fades, Tony Jay, known best for his roles as Froyo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Shere Khan from The Jungle Book, begins the opening narration.
On the clearest of nights, when the winds of the Ethereum were calm and peaceful, the great merchant ships with their cargoes of Arcturian solar crystals felt safe and secure.
It isn't until a minute and 19 seconds into the film that we first get to see our young protagonist, Jim Hawkins, gazing wide-eyed at the legendary Captain Flint and his crew savagely raiding a lonesome merchant ship. As the narration continues, we cut to a shot of Jim laying on his bed, reading, or rather listening to, a holobook of the scene we're watching with him. Oh, wait, you mean the narration wasn't a narration? It's just a book. That's weird. That's actually weird. Disney classically is known for their opening narrations, but it always comes from a place of omniscience, say the Muses in Hercules, or the Rooster in Wolfgang Reitherman's adaptation of Robin Hood. It's never acknowledged within the narrative that their beginning exposition is just a book that a person, especially the protagonist, is reading in the current time of the story taking place. It always comes from the perspective of hindsight. A few seconds later, Jim's mother opens the door to find him reading and, disgruntled, tells him he should already be asleep. Quickly budging, though, she settles down in the bed next to him and they finish the story together. Jim asks his mom if she thinks someone will ever find Treasure Planet, and although at first she tries to explain to him that it's just a story, after he protests that he knows it's real, she concedes that it is with a smile and a kiss goodnight. Right before the film cuts 12 years into the future, and one of the smoothest transitions in Disney history, we see Jim open the holobook again as the opening replays, his silhouette illuminated under his blankets by the same shots we were ushered into the film by just a few minutes ago. So immediately we establish 4 major things within the first 3.5 minutes of the film. 1, Jim is completely captivated by the adventures of Spacers, Treasure Planet's version of sailors. This isn't only shown with his facial expressions and body language as he makes his way through the book, but in the details of his room, like the model ships, his drawings, most notably this one of Captain Flint, and most importantly, what his mother Sarah says when she tucks him back in the bed.
Okay, now it's time for this little spacer to go to sleep.
2. This film takes place in an alternate future. Technology's advancement has in some ways completely halted and in other ways soared past anything we could imagine today. The entire structure of the room they're in is comprised of exposed wooden planks, and they're both dressed in 19th century Victorian clothing, with the rest of the interior following the same theme. But they exist in a world with holographic projection technology and a galaxy full of worlds that great, tall ships traverse between as if they were islands within a vast cosmic ocean. So, steampunk, but refined steampunk, not the DeviantArt top hat wearing golden Nerf gun shit. Similar actually to Disney's 2001 expedition into sci-fi Atlantis, The Lost Empire. 3. Jim and his mother's relationship, at least at this point in time, is clearly very tender and loving. The way she smiles at him, the way they laugh together, the gentle expression she carries through the entire scene, even the tone they say I love you to one another in, just exudes warmth and comfort.
I love you.
And finally, 4. This isn't going to be your run-of-the-mill Disney movie. Like I just mentioned, Treasure Planet isn't the first unorthodox sci-fi adventure film Disney had ever created. Nor is it the first film they've created that doesn't follow the format of a book musical, with an opening narration or song to act as its narration. But it was the first to subvert one of their most common tropes in the opening sequence of the film while being an unorthodox adventure film featuring 0 musical numbers. What makes this opening sequence even better, though, is that the payoff isn't halfway through the movie in terms of the story interacting with these concepts. Every piece of information we're presented with here is immediately built on or juxtaposed in the very next scene, which is actually really refreshing. Not even for a Disney movie, but for the adventure genre in general. Anyways, check out this transition.
There are nights when the winds of the Ethereum, so inviting in their promise of flight and freedom, made one's spirit soar.
Smoother than silk. So, Jim is older, bolder, and sating his ambitions for adventure and sailing the Ethereum by thrill-seeking and moderate hooliganism. Unfortunately for him, though, after this incredible sequence of traditional animation, CG, and deep canvas flowing seamlessly together, he's stopped by the feds and taken back to his mother at their home and family tavern, the Benbow Inn. A slight restyling of the Admiral Benbow, the inn Jim helped his parents run in Treasure Island. Which conveniently brings me to this film's first major divorce from the source material. That is, after the whole sci-fi thing. In the original book of Treasure Island, Jim grows up with both of his parents. It isn't until the pirate Billy Bones shows up warning Jim about the one-legged pirate in this adaptation of Cyborg that Jim's father actually dies. Sad, but ultimately his development as a person through his formative years wasn't affected by it. He grew up with a father present in his life, and he knew both of his parents loved him. Even after his father's passing, he's still very much the bright-eyed boy that Treasure Planet's Jim was in the opening sequence we just watched. In Treasure Planet, however, we learned from a conversation Sarah is having with her friend Dr. Dilbert Doppler, counterpart to the book's Dr. Livesey, that his father actually abandoned them when he was pretty young, and she hasn't known how to deal with him since. Now, not only is this an interesting change to make the protagonist and his situation more accessible to an audience and something a lot of children growing up in the 2000s could sympathize with, it adds a ton more depth to his character as well. The effects of that abandonment at such an early age permeate through every action he's a part of and every decision he makes throughout the film. Treasure Island's Jim is a flat, albeit charming and exciting character. In Treasure Planet, though, we're reintroduced to Jim as a misunderstood rebel, someone who clearly doesn't want his actions to hurt anyone, especially his mother, but doesn't understand how to, or maybe feels it's pointless to try to communicate that to her. He knows he keeps letting her down, but he's resigned himself to the idea that he has no future, so why should he worry? To accentuate the guilt he feels towards how he's hurt his mother, right after he overhears her telling Dilbert all of this, he rushes to the aid of Billy Bones, and although he is given the star map to Treasure Planet that ultimately starts the adventure part of this film, it's at the cost of his mother's tavern and their home. This change takes what was originally just a story of adventure for the sake of riches, vanity, and excitement and completely terraforms the emotional landscape. The main point of development had previously just been Jim growing into a more brave and honorable man, but in Clements and Musker's reimagining, we're taken on an adventure of redemption, driven by Jim's desire to make things up to his mother, because he finally has a chance to prove his worth and pursue the only dream he's ever had, sailing across the Ethereum to Treasure Planet. Jim's abandonment plays a huge role in his relationship not just with his mother and Dilbert, but with John Silver, the main supporting character turned villain turned supporting character. Once introduced, they quickly start to develop a father-son relationship, and this picks up a lot once Silver learns of Jim's past, after he saves him from one of the other crewmen who are secretly under his leadership. Silver is the cyborg that Jim had previously been warned about by Billy Bones in the opening sequence of the film, and although at first Jim is hesitant to trust him, the void Silver begins to fill just by being there for him, existing as a source of support and warmth when Jim hadn't received any from his actual father, is enough to make him ignore his better judgment. He trusts him even though he knows he shouldn't, because it's the closest thing that he's ever had to that presence in his life. And ultimately this comes around in a much more powerful way than it does in Treasure Island, or its original film adaptation, because instead of Jim not having a personal attachment to Silver and being aware of his intent to lead a mutiny from very early on in the story, in Treasure Planet, the person betraying him is the person he sees as a father figure, and seemingly his only friend. And as opposed to just overhearing plans of a mutiny, he overhears Silver renouncing every kind thing he said about Jim, claiming he was only nice to the sniveling little whelp to keep him off their trail. Every change Clements and Musker made in this adaptation wasn't just in an effort to modernize the story for the sake of modernizing it. They very diligently built on the foundation that Stevenson had set out before them to make the central cast of characters feel like they had unique personalities with flaws and idiosyncrasies all their own. Jim is damaged goods. His mother Sarah is working herself to the bone and is handling the loss of the man she loved on top of the emotional disconnect of the only other man she loves. Dilbert is hyper intelligent, but at the expense of any form of social grace or confidence, even going so far as to belittle his own degree. Captain Amelia is so consumed with being in control of the situation and making sure everything is going the way it should that she tries to force her grievous emotional and physical wounds out of mind. Silver has sacrificed half of his limbs chasing Flint's treasure and is most likely just as emotionally isolated as Jim is because of the nature of his position. I mean, fuck, dude, even his cute, like, floating miniature ditto alien dog thing Morph has actual moments of emotional tension in this film. Specifically when he's forced to decide between Silver and Jim, and again when Silver is leaving him with Jim. My point is, a lot of the characters in this film have dimensions to them and shortcomings that juxtapose their positive traits and act as ballast for their personalities. Despite Treasure Planet being much further removed from reality than Treasure Island, even the side characters feel more like a human being than anyone in Treasure Island. In fact, I only have one real complaint with anything in this film in terms of the Oh no. Alright, I don't necessarily dislike Ben, Treasure Planet's counterpart to the crazy Englishman Ben Gunn that they find marooned on Treasure Island in the book, but I think perhaps due to the fear that the film might not have been as full of laughs as the studio is usually known for, Disney packed just a little too many comedy noises into this neurotic robot Jar Jar voiced by Martin Short. Now, most adventure novels, and by proxy adventure films, do feature a sort of plucky comic relief character, someone who exists in the narrative to help the protagonist, but that we know was ultimately only written into it to break up the tediousness of the adventure itself. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, there's plenty of characters who fit that bill pretty comfortably. Pippin and Merry and P-Jack's batch of classics being pretty good examples I could think of off the top of my head. Others that come to mind would be Kikuchio from Seven Samurai, C-3PO and R2, The Flash, Tuco, Nightcrawler, fucking Snap from Chalk Zone. What else? Even within Disney, we have Thumper and Bambi, The Mice and Cinderella, Mr. Smee and Peter Pan, Timon and Pumbaa, Mushu, Bobby, Flounder, and Dopey, who is basically just a tiny Harpo Marx. Point is, there are a lot of characters who exist almost solely as a comedic foil to the protagonist, to alleviate some tension in the audience and provide a counterbalance. And they do it well. You know what the problem with Treasure Planet is? We don't care about him. We're introduced to him almost an hour into the film, and his entire introduction and character development thereafter is just Joseph Gordon-Levitt grappling with Woody Allen as a robot on Dagobah. It's fucking weird. His entire personality is ineptitude compounded by quirky social retardation, with a stand-up routine as his only input to any situation in this entire movie. And this isn't really even a problem with the film itself. The issue more so lies with the source material than it does with how Clements and Musker handled it. Ben Gunn in Treasure Island is not a character that really matters outside of his objective use to the development of the story. He's not someone we have enough time to cultivate any form of attachment towards, and this issue unfortunately boils over into Treasure Planet. I understand his necessity to the plot, but if I ever were to have a bone to pick with this film, it would definitely be Clements and Musker's need to pull the yucks out of their audience when there was no urgency to. Can't really pin it on them though, the blame kind of falls to the Mouse Kingdom at large for that one. Anyways, back to this being a good movie. Earlier, I mentioned the combination of animation styles featured in Treasure Planet, specifically this scene. One of the reasons this film is so unique within Disney's catalog is that it actually utilized a mixture of Disney's classic style of traditional 2D animation, seen here, modern CG animation, seen here, and a pretty abundant use of Disney's deep canvas technology, seen here. Not that it's the only one of their modern films to use these in conjunction with one another, but it used the latter more than any other and pushed the limits of what they could do more than any other of their films. Shots like this and this one here are some of the big reasons this film became one of the costliest features in Disney's history. So what exactly is Deep Canvas? Deep Canvas is a 3D modeling program created by a brain trust of Disney art directors and computer programmers for use on their 1999 classic Tarzan. If you've ever wondered how their artist drew every frame of the roller coaster-like tree sliding sequence, or even the closing scene of the film when Jane decides to stay, they didn't. See, Deep Canvas allows a team of technician artists to sculpt a dynamic environment out of rough geometric shapes that they then track the camera through. Once the sequence is complete, it's sent to character animators who then draw the characters and sometimes the immediate points of interaction with their environment in shifting perspectives for each frame, and at the same time is sent over to the background painters who take these gray shapes and turn them into a lush background environment for each shot. And voila, with truckloads of money going to programmers and animators, Disney could now accomplish what live action directors were able to do with a Steadicam, and they could do it in hours instead of months. In itself, the give or take 10 minutes of Deep Canvas use in Tarzan was animation magic when it was released, and 18 years later it still is. In Treasure Planet though, Deep Canvas is featured in nearly the entire film's runtime. Why would they need to use Deep Canvas for that much of the film, you ask? because the entire RLS Legacy, the ship most of the film takes place on, was created using the software. So every scene where the characters are interacting with the ship as a 3D environment, Disney had to pay technicians and animators to create in Deep Canvas. It came at a great expense to the company, but what we got were shots that felt less like paintings and more like photographs, with tangible, three-dimensional environments in every frame. Something that I think was well worth their money, even if they couldn't make it back. So if you hadn't noticed it in this shot I played earlier, I bet at this point you're wondering where the CG came into this. Due to the difficulty of hand drawing all the small, constant movements required to create a believable cyborg arm and leg, let alone an entire robot, Disney actually had Silver's natural body and clothing animated by hand, while his cybernetic arm and leg were both flat rendered CG animations superimposed into each frame. And the same was done with all of Ben. CG animated, rendered flat, superimposed into the shot. So in this frame here, for instance, we have Jim, who was drawn by hand, Silver, whose right arm and leg were animated in a computer, and the environment around them, which is somewhere in between the two. And it all comes together in a very natural feeling way. In fact, on your first watch through the film, you don't even notice the more obvious pieces of CG animation, like this space whale's eye, for instance. Not only did Clements and Musker manage to put a ton of technology and different animation talent into this film, they did it without any piece of it feeling like it wasn't part of the composition. Everything flows with everything else perfectly. Also, touching on color for a bit, though I won't go too far into it, Jim's clothing actually evolves with him throughout the film. At the start, he's draped in a very Victorian-era James Dean getup, complete with black shirt and dark brown jacket. Once he's settled into the ship in his journey, we see him shed those colors for a lighter brown shirt, and finally, in the closing scene of the film, he's draped in a white, red, and gold Academy uniform. So black is frequently used to signify unhappiness and grief, and in our reintroduction to Jim, he's still grieving over his loss of his father, even though it's internalized and largely only comes out as anger and spite towards him later in the film. It's a menacing, cold color, even if it can, in the right context, signify sophistication or efficiency, neither of which are things he necessarily lacks, by the way. As we remove some of the black from the dark brown he was previously shrouded in, more of the red and orange come through. Lighter hues of brown are often used in film to express a sense of warmth and resilience, and Jim comes more into his own as he grows through his journey. As he progresses, even after Silver's betrayal, there persists a genuine sense of determination and confidence within Jim that for the first leg of his journey just weren't really something he had in spades. And finally, with the closing sequence, we see him dressed in colors that represent love, reverence, strength, grandeur, peace, and rebirth. Jim has come home a new person, or rather the person his mother and Silver knew he could be, and Clements and Musker's choice for this final change in clothing makes sure we know it. Since I'm on the topic of this scene, by the way, I feel like it's an appropriate time to mention the score of the film, and by proxy, the sound design. When Clements and Musker began working on this film, they created a rule for themselves in terms of how they would balance the film's aesthetic. They wanted enough sci-fi to feel futuristic, but enough Victorian influence to not feel synthetic or cold in nature. Basically, they wanted more pirates than they did ice pirates. The balance they eventually decided on was referred to by the team as the 70-30 rule. So 70% of each design would be pre-20th century Victorian and 30% of it would be sci-fi. Hence the 17th century ship with solar sails and rocket thrusters. What's interesting about this though, and what makes this film especially unique, is that the score of the film and the sound design within it were held to the same rule. So in this sequence here, it's the closing sequence of the film, right? Jim saves the crew, Silver and Jim make up, Silver leaves, Jim and the remaining characters go home. In the score of the film, the piece playing throughout this is appropriately called Silver Leaves. Now, this plays for about 5 minutes throughout nearly the entire end of the film, until this shot here, when we cut to Jim standing at the back of the room, looking on as Sarah and his friends celebrate their safe return and the reconstruction of the Benbow Inn. The second Jim comes into frame, Silver leaves, and the ambience from all of the people in the inn quickly fade out of the foreground and are replaced by the last track in the film, Always Know Where You Are. Listen to the difference.
It's good to see the sun and feel this place I never thought would feel like home. And I ran forever, far away, and I always thought I'd end up here alone.
Okay, so pretty stark contrast, right? I'm gonna explain why it works though, so check it out. Despite the music in this film largely being an orchestral score composed by James Newton Howard, it also features 2 contemporary pop rock songs, written and performed by John Resnick from the Goo Goo Dolls and British rock group BB Mac. To assure the rest of the audio in the film was consistent with the visual aesthetic and the score's ratio of orchestral to contemporary music, sound designer Dane Davis's team scoured hobby shops and junk stores to find antique wind-up toys and spinning mechanisms for all of Silver's arm and leg movements, and applied this same philosophy to the rest of the film's sound design as well. Every movement from every character, every creak on the ship, every time a character opens or closes a door, it feels real. That's how an oak door with an old brass handle would sound. When the sound design is synthetic though, for instance the explosions or the firing of weapons or the thrusters on the back of the ships, it feels consistent with what we're being presented with visually. The deck of the ship is creaking, but it still goes whoosh when they're going fast. That makes sense. The sound of the film, both design and score, was diligently shaped to follow the visual aesthetic as to not remove the viewer from the experience. Now, the score features less of a consistent ratio, like in the way the visuals and sound design were created, but compensates for that by framing the 2 contemporary songs to be more important than any other piece of music in the film. By having virtually no audio play over them and using both of these tracks during major emotional apexes for the main character in the film, they inherently become the most prominent tracks in the score. When they're playing, they are the centerpiece. Everything you're seeing is being presented to you with this song and this song only as the information you're going to take with it. And this is executed actually really well. The lyricism in the 2 tracks perfectly reflect how Jim is feeling in those moments of the film and how Musker and Clements want us to feel during those moments. To make this contrast of sound feel even more natural, by the time the first contemporary track in the score, titled I'm Still Here, begins to play, we've already had over 30 minutes to become comfortable with the aesthetic balance of the film. It's not any more something to question than the spaceport shaped like a crescent moon, or the ship they're on still having normal rope and rigging, or Jim using a mop and bucket that look like something out of the Sorcerer's Apprentice while he's floating in an alternate version of space with breathable air. Treasure Planet starts us off with such a distinct juxtaposition of influence that everything else it introduces us to for the rest of the film, both visually and aurally, unquestionably belongs in that world. So why did it fail? I mean, it had a reasonably famous child actor as its lead. It was visually ahead of anything else it released. It was an adaptation of one of the most famous children's stories of all time. It had a great score. I mean, it's a Disney movie, a really good one. Released during a period where animation studios were dropping unorthodox adventure film sans fairy tale more than Kilodrop classics. So where did it go wrong? This is gonna come off a little tinfoil hatty, but bear with me, okay? I don't think Disney, at least not those at the top, really wanted this film to succeed. I mentioned the budget to you earlier, right? This is what this video is ultimately about, how much money the film lost. So because of all the bells and whistles put into this film and the length of its production, it ended up costing Disney $140 million to make, plus another $40 million for marketing. Of that, its world box office gross was $109.5 million, and only like 34% of that came from domestic box office. Its opening week, it sat at 4th place in terms of popularity, and it only plummeted from there. So not only did the film lose the company $71 million, it wasn't even very popular in America. Why? How could that even happen? I mean, Disney's marketing team could sell wood to a forest. They're not exactly known for being an infamidable force in terms of making sure everybody knows their new shit is coming out. Remember Lilo and Stitch? 6 months before it even touched a projector, we were seeing Stitch knock down chandeliers with Belle and the Beast, surfing with Ariel, and giving presentations at Pride Rock. You had an entire marketing campaign that boldly pronounced to every kid in the country, hey, this is the new shit. This is going to be exciting and different. This is going to take place at the old Disney movies you like. While at the same time, McDonald's was offering Lilo, Stitch, and Nani in every Happy Meal. And it was released at the start of the summer. You know what it was released against? The fucking live-action Scooby-Doo movie. That's literally it. You know what Treasure Planet was released against? The first Harry Potter. And Disney's own movie, The Santa Claus 2, both of which sat at the #1 spot for their opening week. Disney released a summer movie right before Christmas against one of the highest grossing series debuts ever and a sequel to their own Christmas movie. On top of that, almost all of the marketing for Treasure Planet either didn't communicate anything about the film and just had clips of Jim riding his Solar Surfer, or it was commercials like these, where they literally spoil the fucking film.
Jim Hawkins.
We are so out of here!
Ben.
I've lost my mind.
And
What is that thing?
It's a more.
on November 27th,
Go, Delbert! Go, Delbert!
Brace yourself.
Three unlikely heroes are taking on the meanest cyborg in the universe.
Pirates on my ship.
Not only do they reveal the antagonist, they reveal the secondary character we aren't even supposed to know exists until an hour into the story, and we know Morph takes Jim's side instead of staying with Silver. This is on television months before it releases in theaters. But it doesn't stop there. Disney, like any large company, have marketing surveys because they're smart people, and keeping your finger to the pulse of your audience is a smart person thing to do. At least 4 months before Treasure Planet was scheduled to be released, the marketing surveys they got back as to why audiences weren't interested in Treasure Planet is because they finally caught on to Disney's release patterns. It wasn't because they didn't want to watch it, but because of how much home movie had caught on and how much Disney had embraced the DVD trend in recent years. They knew if a Disney movie came out in the winter, it'd be available by the spring or summer. They'd already started to see commercials for the Lilo and Stitch DVD coming out that December, so they could just watch Treasure Planet at home. And Disney, knowing this, knowing what it was competing against at the box office, knowing the sales projections of each film, didn't even attempt to ramp up its marketing or move its release further into the winter. Disney sent Treasure Planet out to die, and the reason why is pretty clear. Features like Monsters, Inc., Ice Age, and A Bug's Life killed at the box office and had Disney wanting to shift directions. I mean, the chairman that approved the film in the first place, Katzenberg, hadn't been with the company since 1994. By the time the film was ready to release, the company had been through 2 different chairmen with completely different ideas of where the company should be heading. What loyalty did they have to the project? A sequel for Treasure Planet had already been arranged and set to enter pre-production, but why would they even want to make another 2D animated film utilizing incredibly expensive technology like Deep Canvas for most of the film's duration? What better way to tie up loose ends and not honor your agreement for a sequel than to forcefully let the film die? No executive on the planet, regardless of Clements and Musker's pedigree within the Mouse House, would ever let Treasure Planet 2 leave the ground if the first film crashed and burned. And that's exactly what happened. An entire storyboarded sequel that had already casted Willem Dafoe as its antagonist was locked away in the brig, never to see the light of day. And what's sad is Treasure Planet actually received positive critical reception. Disney themselves were surprised by its Oscar nomination for Best Animated Picture, and they shouldn't have been. It was one of their most well-made adventure films, and given the rough synopsis that I found for it in this Animated Views article that I'll link in the description, the sequel could have been even better. Treasure Planet, Brother Bear, and Home on the Range ended up being the last 2D features Disney would release until The Princess Frog in 2009 and Winnie the Pooh in 2011. After the massive failure that was Treasure Planet and the smaller failure that was Home on the Range, all it took was one more film not having a blowout performance in theaters for them to close the vault on traditional animation in the happiest studio on earth for good. As a matter of fact, right now, the only traditional animators left in Disney's pay that couldn't adapt to computer animation are paid to do projection mapping for the light shows at Disney World. Maybe I'm being a little too accusatory towards the Disney execs of yesteryear. Maybe it wasn't their intention to kill Treasure Planet. I mean, sometimes good men die a bad man's death, and at the end of the day, the same could be said for film. Even animated film. I mean, look at Cats Don't Dance, or The Road to El Dorado, or even The Iron Giant. I've never met a person who's seen those films that didn't love them. But sometimes the box office just isn't that kind. But what if I'm right? And the other theories and articles alleging the same thing since its release are right. And Disney did GIMP, their own feature to set in motion the end of their 2D animated films. I think it's easy to get carried away in thinking art, especially art we love as a kid, is unfettered by the conventions of society and what makes society function. Like I said at the start of this video, Disney is a Goliath built with solid gold blocks. It's a business, a massive one. They make art, but their art is commerce, and something that seemed like an ill-fated flop 15 years ago today looks a lot more like the beginning of an end that Disney themselves set in motion. I don't know. Something about the happiest place on earth crippling the release of a project full of love and ambition from 2 of their most faithful directors kind of kills the illusion for me. Sorry if it did for you too. Have a good night.